Welcome back. You're watching Global Today. Right now we want to change our gears a bit and see what is happening at the African Union Summit. That is the 36th ordinary session of the African Union, which is underway in Addis Ababa. And we're given to understand that 4 countries were not represented after being suspended over military takeover. That is Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Sudan. And also we put tails on what we have on the front page of the East African. Tshisekedi pushes Rwanda censure, and he wants the M23 backers reprimanded, and also the East African forces mandate reviewed to include combat. But the EU prefers diplomacy. Will diplomacy work? That is a probing question. Has it worked before? Will it work now in trying to stymie the situation in DRC and Rwanda? And this is where I want to rope in Dr. Kanenje on this as well. First of all, we've heard from the military leaders of Sudan saying that the October coup was a mistake. Because it was a mistake.
Yeah, it was a mistake. I think.
But aren't all coups mistakes?
It was a mistake when they. It wasn't a mistake from the assessment when they did it. It was by design. But just like many things we regret having done, when we thought we were justified, it comes majuto ni mjukuu. It comes later after it has happened, and after the fact, they've realized that Sudan is not in a better place; it's actually in a worse place than it was before. You know, and that this status quo right now is not in favor of them or ability of Sudan to be able to put itself back as a viable country and a viable economy. Despite the Abraham Accords that they hoped was going to open doors of investment and monies from the West, you know, that hasn't come through. It was removed from as a state sponsor of terror list by the United States. You know, that has not transformed or translated into monies and investments coming into Sudan, because there is a stalemate with regard to the governance. And so capitalism does not like instability or high risks. They like predictability. And so I think that is the reason why Sudan is also still suffering. But perhaps, you know, going to the AU itself, if you can allow me.
Sure.
Yes, because we're talking about M23. This current AU session has been a significant number of ways. Number one, it's about 20 years since the AU came into formation. There is so much that has happened. 2011 was a turning point in AU's history and governance, in part that because of the incident that involved the overthrow and killing of Muammar Gaddafi, who played an instrumental role in actually funding lots of AU activities. And that pushed the continent into some kind of disarray when it comes to its commitments. Today, AU's budget of around $600–700 million is largely funded by donors and the West, which again is a little bit shameful. And of course, we sit in the house built by the Chinese and the Germans. I think as Prof would probably know by now. So we're not even sitting in our own house yet. So that's also another embarrassment.
China and Belgium.
Germany. Yes. And our own president here gave us, was interviewed by Al Jazeera while there. And, many may have lots of disagreements, but I think that was a very brilliant interview with regard to the speaking to the kind of what I call global financial apartheid when it comes to borrowing, by the developing countries. We're borrowing at 10%, the bigger ones and more advanced ones are borrowing at 0.5, 1% or even a quarter of a percentage, which of course again is fair. And I think he spoke on behalf of not just Africa, but on most countries in the developing world. And that I think should make us also rethink the kind of engagements we're having and the kind of interest we're actually forced to pay, whether that's even sustainable in the future, and perhaps raise our own agents within the international system. Now, coming back to DRC, Tshisekedi has rightly in certain ways been frustrated by what he thinks is a protracted conflict that is being fueled by neighbors in eastern DRC. Now, his preference is that the priority of the East African Regional Force, which has actually been endorsed by African Union with regard to its expanded, in terms of size, engagement, he prefers that force prioritize, dealing with M23. Of course, it's important to remember that there are more than 120, militant groups, in DRC, especially in Eastern DRC, which also happens, unfortunately, to be called the rape capital in the world, where rape, more than any other place, has been used as an instrument of war. And this is a question that is not really discussed.
Excuse me.
The tension between Rwanda and Burundi and Congo is actually threatening the entire cohesion within the kind of approach we're having in the East African community. And aircraft's mandate may be affected by some of these tensions if we do not find a way to dialogue, out of it. Congo claims that, M23 have not honored both the Rwanda and the Bujumbura, agreements that, they're supposed to undertake certain actions. And it's seeing Rwanda as being complicit, and yet is supposed to be part of this force. And I think this is something that will need to be discussed by the regional leaderships to see what can be done to be able to build confidence, because if DRC do not have confidence in aircraft, it may not be cooperative in ensuring the success of the mission. And so, is it time that perhaps we try and see how we can reduce the level of engagement of the Rwandese military without necessarily saying we're expelling them because then they're part of the East African community? Or what other areas should they be allowed to operate? Because if we do not resolve these and just, not listen to Tshisekedi, I think it's going to be very difficult for actually us to register success. And this is especially important since Kenya is actually taking the lead. And this has been part of Kenya's, what I call pet projects, ensuring that in the region we get the kind of stability that we deserve. And so talking and dialoguing around it, it is not an option anymore. Inaction over the kind of differences that are going on is not an option. We need to start talking. We will need our own leaders, especially in the original East African community countries, to put heads together to ensure that the composition of that may have somehow to be moderated in ways that, number one, does not isolate Rwanda, but in ways that can be able to give some confidence in the DRC, in government in Kinshasa, in order for aircraft to actually succeed. Because if we fail there, then I'm not so sure about even the entire project of the EAC, whether it's going to be very viable in the next 5 or 10 years.
So don't you think, in a way, when he's asking that we review the mandate of the East African Regional Force right there, which is purely for peacekeeping in the first place, to include combat, isn't that really opening a Pandora's box as well? Given that now it is combat and people also within the region have interests within DRC. Is he asking more than he can chew?
Part of the reason, I think, is because of what he thinks the threat there is. You see, there is peacekeeping. You go peacekeeping to keep peace where there is peace. And I think in his assessment,
you go
peacekeeping to keep peace where there is peace.
Where there is peace.
Yes.
But in this instance, there is no peace.
Yes, or potential for peace. Or let's say there's an agreement of peace and therefore you want to ensure that you maintain that peace. In Tshisekedi's assessment, there is no peace, there is war. In his assessment, country A has waged war, against its own country through using, M23. And so he would like, literally, that these people are faced down and ensure that they're eliminated, they're removed from it. But as we've discussed on this panel, the problem is bigger. And I do like what the president said in Addis, that this is going to go hand in hand with another political process with regard to the parties in question. Because the political problem in Eastern Congo has to be solved, especially the question of ethnic nationhood. That problem needs to be sorted out. And so if they go hand in hand at the same time, they stand a chance of success. If they do not, it's unlikely that Rwanda, for instance, is going to give up its what it's going to look at, it's trying to defend itself against a potential threat coming from outside, which means the problem of F-23 may persist. But it's important at this stage to be able to reach a compromise to allow aircraft to undertake its mandate, while at the same time, both Rwanda and Burundi, Rwanda and DRC, not to feel threatened or not to feel undermined.
Don't you think it sounds a bit convoluted when we have the East Africa regional forces that is a contribution of all East African countries, inclusive of Rwanda as well, isn't it?
Yes.
And then we are also stalking the line of combat. I find that to be actually, dealing with an open fire.
Sorry.
It's profits.
Well, this problem is historical. This problem is complex. And so it needs to be really understood from that standpoint. And simply, what tool do you use? Let's begin. When you look at the resource deposit in the Congo itself, in that area, it is estimated at $24 trillion. That's almost the size of the U.S. gross national product. Chinese 17, Russia is 2 trillion, probably is gone down. So everybody is there.
Excuse me.
Both government and businesses and interests like a Wagner Group, they're all there, and they're all looking at opportunity to explore. And they will not have that opportunity if there is an organized government in the control. What is understood and what's very clear is the East Africa community can continue to benefit out of resources that are coming out of the Congo if we do it together and do it rationally. And that is where President Uhuru was coming in. A legitimate person who can talk directly with Tshisekedi and also talk to Kagame and also talk to Uganda president and pat them on the back and say, this is us, together we have to solve this. And so this is very important that diplomacy take place. Because if we go there with the force, who are you fighting? Because M23 will say, hey, we were refugees, but we've been here for a long time. We're now Congolese. Tshisekedi is saying they're not Congolese, they have to go back to Rwanda. And so all that need to be understood within the East Africa framework, and it's beginning to take place. And therefore, what needs to happen is, let's not jump. I mean, the president of Congo may want to solve the problem before election. It's not going to happen. It's going to take longer than that. But it has to be understand the history and the complexity involved, and then finance the East Africa standby force. Give them teeth.
Yes.
But focus on diplomacy first. Yeah. Before you isolated the bad guys. There are a lot of bad guys from outside Africa who are there. Isolate them and say, these are the bad guys, these are the force we are going to fight.
Right.
That's my prof.
Now, first, I think we started off very well before you narrowed into Congo, which I think is important for us as part of the East African community. But we need to take a retrospective view of what is happening 20 years on from the African Union and what we have today. Is the African Union still, as robust as it was at the beginning, or has it literally, given up? I think there are certain things that have changed fundamentally. Africa still maintains that the future of the state in Africa is the rule of law. And that's important. And that's why the debate about coups is coming in. It's coming in because any unconstitutional takeover of government, whether it is legitimate or illegitimate, does not necessarily lead to stability, peace and stability. And peace and security are considered by the African Union as preconditions for development. So if you don't have this, then we have a problem. That is something to maintain. But the second thing is why the African Union was created in the first place. It was created as a buffer zone between us and a very hostile world order. It is not stated as such in the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. But the fact that Africa is the only part of the world that has its own Security Council, apart from the world, tells you that from our own history of slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism, we have become extremely suspicious of the world. And we see security in our own collectivity. So when people say that Africa is in chaos, therefore we need to intervene, people ask question, one, why are we intervening? Why didn't we intervene in Rwanda? Because Rwanda had no minerals that were taken. Why has MONUSCO been the longest serving peacekeeping force in Congo? Because Congo has minerals. And therefore, what came out of this particular summit is the lingering suspicion by the African people, legitimate and right, in regard to the international order. So therefore, you saw the establishment of the humanitarian agency, the African Humanitarian Agency. Why? Because the international humanitarian agency basically has become business, not really support for African countries as such. And you don't need to belabor that point. It is in the same context that President William Ruto was talking about the role of IMF and the World Bank. They are having double standards. And it is in the same context that we have to see the Refugee Convention, the AU Refugee Convention, as opposed to the 1951 Geneva Convention and the 1967 Protocol on Refugees. So in a sense, we need to keep that in mind. And if you have that in mind, then you can see why the issue of the Great Lakes region is so important. Because this is Africa trying to heal itself. African solution to African problems. But the problem I have with that is, again, what we talked about, the North Rift. No clear knowledge about. And I thought everybody should be having Mahmoud Mamdani's book, When the Victims Become Killers. If you have Mamdani's book, When the Victims Become Killers, which is a primary empirical research for more than 5 years, conducted within the framework of the leading African think tank, which is Codestria. And it has not only analysis but prescription. Then you would understand that you not start dealing with the Congo problem like a Congo problem. It's a Rwandese problem, first and foremost. It is a Burundian problem. Because for centuries, the distressed part of the Rwanda and Burundi, what they call Urundi those days, would always take cover in Congo. And every time, so the conclusion is made even by French analysts that at one point, a section of Rwanda, a section of Burundi will be in Congo. Population. And over the years, this population is Rwandese in origin, but is Congolese by citizenship. Now, so you are going to deal with M23, but what are you dealing with? You are dealing with centuries of people interacting in the situations of distress. So when Kenya now comes in and we propose what we've proposed, it's good enough because we need to separate. But remember, there is no peace to keep because there is no peace agreement. So what we needed in the first place was to have an agreement. An agreement between who? Between Congo and Rwanda and partly Uganda and Burundi.
Yes.
Then you take a very deep analysis of why did SADC, led by the African Union, led by South Africa and Tanzania and Burundi, fail in its intervention in Congo.
But this was a matter of emergency.
Where?
It was a matter of emergency because they went there because there's an emergency in DRC. What we are talking about.
They have always been emergencies.
That's what I'm saying. Why were they prompted to actually deploy these forces?
Who? The Kenya?
I mean, the East African community.
No, but before that time, there was an emergency, and they even came with what
if there was an emergency,
yes,
then under what ambit will you have sent these particular forces?
That's
if
why,
it's not the peacekeeping.
Now, if you look at diplomatic relations in Africa, you can comfortably say, without any contradiction, that Rwanda and South Africa are not good friends. You can say Rwanda and Burundi are not good friends. Why? Because these are the people who sent troops to Eastern Congo. Now, today, we have demonstration in Goma and small towns against Kenya. Why?
Because the propaganda is there.
No.
That you're taking sides.
So what we are saying is there is no comprehensive approach to the problem which would bring the real combatants on the table. The real combatants are not M23 and the Congolese militias.
So
the
question is, did we send the forces there? Premise on a very wrong objective.
No. There is a difference between intentions, good intentions. If you read Kofi Annan's book, good intentions
and the road to hell.
And the road to hell. Those are two different things. Good intentions don't always lead to good results. And we have good intentions.
Can also be a good parallel to also road to hell.
That's what we're saying. We have good intentions as a country to resolve the question in Eastern Congo. But in so doing, are we armed with sufficient knowledge and analysis of Congo and the nature of the problem? And have we asked the question, why has the world, the United Nations, failed to resolve the question? Why did SADC, our neighbor, fail to resolve the question? And what do we need to do, armed with that knowledge, in order to have a more lasting solution to this problem? That is where the problem is coming in.
Amilcar Cabral gave us a maxim that all Africans have to live by. That one is tell no lies and claim no easy victory. The president of Rwanda was a refugee in Uganda for 30 years. More, maybe 40. People forget the president of Rwanda was a member of the NRA, Uganda's Liberation, Museveni's army. He was the head of intelligence. The fellow who created the thing used to walk down the streets of Nairobi as a young man. I remember him, called Fred Rugema.
Yes, Fred Rugema.
Inside the minds of the political elite in Rwanda is this writ large concept of refugees. They're in a constant state of nervousness because they have been made refugees every other decade. So they went and formed this group so that they made sure there'll be no more refugees in their country. Now, when they're dealing with Mr. Tshisekedi thinks of Rwanda as a society of medium-height Bantus. And when he sees these tall Hashis, these are our descendants, we went there in the 15th century, he gets a nervous breakdown because he says, these herdsmen are taking over my country. It's the same symptom here in North Rift, where the Pokot see William Ruto as the president of the Kalenjins and not the president of Kenya. And he's an invading chief. This is how they see it. Debal, we have to understand the political economy of history, as my seniors here have been talking about how to make sure that some things are done. And there's some very basic premises. The people of Eastern Congo are the citizens of the Republic, of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The country is named after Demos and Kratos. You know, democracy is two fellows. One was called Demos and the other one was called Kratos. And they were debating. They were telling Western civilization had been lying about this because they got that information from Kemet. Pythagoras was hanging around in the pyramid for 15 years before he was allowed to go to school there. The African people are the ones who taught these fellows about democracy. It is not them who are teaching us about democracy. It's just scientific facts. I'm not theorizing anything. So the people of Eastern Congo are citizens of the DRC. What do we need in the Eastern Sea, in that Great Lakes Republic? We need Congo, we need the Burundians, and we need the Rwandese, and we need the Gabonese. We need all these people to come together to form their own East Africa there. This is the way forward. And for them, for the person in Eastern Congo and the person in Rwandese to be indistinguishable. That you from Kinshasa can drive all the way to Rwanda and buy a house and set up a business and no one can talk to you. Because their ancestors were doing those things, Demal. My grandfather, Haji Ali Hashim, Allah Rahma, walked to Kigali from Ngong to buy cattle from the Rwandese. And he had Maasai herdsmen as his protectors. The Kamba community was walking all the way to Durban, Deba. Do you know why the Kambas have these light skins? Because they've been marrying Zulus from Durban. They brought women here to Ukambani. That's why they have this light complexion that looks like the Zulus. We have been intermarrying and having an identity as Africans for centuries. These colonial borders, Deba, just came yesterday with Sir Evelyn Baring. We have to have the political will to crush these borders and say that the guy, there's a former minister here who told me that if Raila Odinga became president, he would go home. I forget his name, he died. I won't name him. And I asked him where he's home. He told me it's Uganda. And I was shocked. I said, how come they're just telling us the Somalis, Murudi yuko Somalia? Kumbe kila mtu ametoka mahali hapa. Deba, we have to expose these lies, these subterfuges, that we are Africans and we have to fight for this idea so that we can live honorable lives on our continent. This failure of leadership between Mr. Kagame and Mr. Tshisekedi is terrible. They should have been able to solve the problem of the... It's not easy. It's not a hard question. It is not simple. It is the shaking of hands of men and saying, those are your citizens, those are my citizens. We are going to trade. We are going to bring down these barriers. We are not going to fight. Mr. Tshisekedi, you cannot say the Banyamulenge don't belong in Congo. And Mr. Museveni, Mr. Kagame, you can't take truckloads of diamonds and gold, relabel them in Rwanda and in Kampala, and send them to Dubai and say that you're exporting diamonds and gold from Uganda and Rwanda. It's not acceptable. That's that country's wealth.
Well, but that is your own opinion.
It's not an opinion.
I just don't have any scrap of evidence.
No, actually.
Yeah.
It's not an opinion.
Actually,
ask the professor.
Actually, Uganda export more gold than Uganda is able to produce. Majority of that gold is coming
from the DRC.
DRC. So
they brought a container here.
Burundi, all benefit from that. And so the point, the point that we raised earlier, is should we send a force, a military force, or should we send diplomacy? What is the answer? And I think the point that my two colleagues here talk about is that we are able to create the East African community. When I carry my passport now as East Africa community, and then it has Kenya. And therefore, I can go to Burundi, and I can go to Rwanda, and I can go to Congo, and I will go in the future to Somalia without using visa. If I choose to live in Burundi and call that my home in the future, then that will be my home. So the point, President Uhuru, bless his heart, was able to reach Tshisekedi in a very, very personal way. That's the height of diplomacy. And is able to talk to Kagame, and Kagame listen. And so the point is, Kagame has legitimate fear.
Yeah.
We cannot just rule it and say we are brotherly.
Yeah.
He has legitimate fear because it's a small number of people that live there. They've fought for years. They've been refugees for years. And say we cannot be refugees anymore. So the assurance is that we're coming together jointly to address this problem.
Correct.
From an East African standpoint.
Point of view, yes.
And therefore, the people who are interested in this gold mine, who are marketing it and doing everything, you are East African. We cannot do that.
Okay, well, maybe we need just to hear some sound, but on the sidelines of the conversations on what is really happening at the AU, not necessarily on DRC and Rwanda's part that is ongoing, but generally just the AU summit. Then when you circle back, it seems that the President Tshisekedi himself is particularly intense on seeing combat more than the AU diplomacy. So when it's torn between AU diplomacy and combat,
that's all.
Yeah, he wants combat. So no. he would hear none of anything to do with diplomacy right now. But let's just hear from what other leaders have to say during this particular 36th ordinary session that is happening in Ethiopia.
Today, the countries that are confronted with terrorism are left on their own to defend for themselves with general indifference. I can understand the bitterness of these make operational the African standby force, establish a unit that will fight against terrorism in a more consistent manner, in a more foreseeable manner.
Ethiopia is where it is today in no small part because of the tireless efforts of the African Union and the wisdom of its deeply held belief in the principle of African solution to African problems.
Without a doubt, Africa stands at the threshold of actualizing the aspirations set out in AU Agenda 2063 and delivering the Africa we want by championing fundamental institutional reform in the political and development finance sectors, implementing the ACFTA, implementing reforms of the Africa Union and silencing the guns of our beautiful continent. I want to assure you our sustained commitment in pursuit of Africa's transformation for shared prosperity, development, peace and security. Your efforts eloquently demonstrates your loyalty to the people of Africa. I am proud to join you in the service of the African people as one of your newest members and pledge to walk this road with you in the spirit of brotherhood and diligently do my part to advance our shared aspirations.
So African solutions to African problem. I will begin with Dr. Hassan Kanenje. African solution to African problem. When you hear these leaders, we are just there to pacify AU. These leaders, they don't pay the remittances to the AU, most of them. And they're talking about African solutions to African problem. You were here talking before that largely we have Europe, which is steamrolling a lot of African Union's activities. We're talking about China, even where they're meeting right now. That is a building that actually was funded by China itself. It was a gift.
It's a gift.
It was actually a gift from China. Mm-hmm. And people are also talking about maybe that particular building itself, there's a bit of snooping that is happening. Now with the balloons which are hovering all over, snooping cannot be an exception as well. I don't know, but you know what I'm talking about. So when you talk about African solutions to African problems, are we ourselves just shooting our own fits?
African solutions to African problems is partly informed by the spirit of African Renaissance. And it is aspirational. It hasn't been actualized yet, but it's aspirational. And in the spirit...
aspirational, what is the timeline? I mean, that's the time since I started hearing about African Renaissance. It's almost going to 20 years.
You see...
And I wonder when is this Renaissance, coming to fruition?
You know, when Harry Thuku formed the Kikuyu Central Association, was aspirational in trying to give a lot more independence to indigenous communities, especially where he came from. Even though later on, I think he was deported to Kismayo, right, Prof?
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But at least it laid foundation stones for political parties that emerged, in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, the reason I'm saying this is aspirational is there are aspects of it that has informed some of the engagement you have seen. And it's true that even though for instance, the peace initiatives in Tigray were supported by, the outside world, they were largely, led by Africans. In fact, in any case, the outside world had reduced its influence to minimal, in part because of the perceived interventions or biases that they had, especially with regard to the conflict in Ethiopia. The West did not have much influence on the government in Addis Ababa, and neither the East did they have influence, of course, on the opposing party. But because of the faith of stability and the intervention of regional countries and the African Union, we have seen progress in that line. Things are not perfect, but to the extent that actually Abiy Ahmed has already met, his arch rivals and the people who are perceived to be enemies, I think is something significant. Second, within that spirit, has also informed even Kenya's own engagement in the DRC and the efforts being currently made. And I think our current president of Kenya probably believes in the same, that we need to move in that direction. Remember, this is not something that began recently. The outgoing president, Uhuru Kenyatta, was really one of the leading Pan-Africanists we have seen in recent years. And I think that speaks to the renewed faith. The challenge is, though, we need to put our money where our mouth is. Now, that has to start with strengthening our own regional institutions, either whether it's the East African Community or IGAD, which had suffered extensively in the past few years. Hopefully we can be able to revive it, but also capacitate the regional bodies to be able to undertake this. Now, the AU's budget, as I mentioned, is, I think, just below $700 million. Kenya's, I think, budget is around $35 billion. Okay, which means that is a fraction of actually Kenya's budget. Do you want to tell me that 52 African countries can actually not be able to raise even $1 billion to be able to do their work? Okay, it's a shame. Now,
that's why I'm asking, the African solutions to African problems.
And so, even to be able to maintain some of this, especially when it comes to reorganizing a security architecture, that we have more input into it so that our deployment is not dependent on foreign funding. Remember, right now, the West is more concerned about what is happening on geopolitically in Ukraine than it is about us. That's just a fact. There is no one in the West who is even going to deny that. That's a fact. They are pouring billions of dollars into Ukraine, which means a lot of challenges that we face, we're going to have to find a way to actually deal with it. Number two, who say that we are entitled to Western money? We're not. We have certain resources we can be able to bring to bear. And so as the AU conducts this session, they also need to actually start asking themselves the tough questions. Are we doing enough in terms of the commitments to ensure we put in place the kind of architecture and infrastructure to build our countries, but also to protect our nations, potential collapse, and make interventions viable? Today, one of the challenges, we've spoken about it on this panel, in Somalia, is that the government and the citizens are doing a lot in fighting against Al-Shabaab. Okay. What is the continent doing to ensure that those investments are sustained, or rather those achievements are protected? Because one thing that needs to follow is institutional as well as economic capacity building of those communities. So you remove the vulnerabilities that made them join Al-Shabaab in the first place, or at least made Al-Shabaab exploit them. What exactly are we doing as a continent? And when you start asking yourself those tough questions, it becomes a challenge. Number two, the mission, the mandate of ATMIS is coming to an end very soon. Is Somalia prepared? What are we discussing as African Union, for instance, as Africans? What should we do to help Somalia to ensure that it actually does not slide back into that conflict? Fundamentally, what are we doing in terms of mobilizing our own internal resources to ensure we actually, when you talk about African solutions to African problems, solutions require money, solutions require resources, and that is a place where we're not working very well. But the thinking and the intention is great, but good intentions are not always followed by good results.
So you had also Abby really talking about how African Union has been instrumental in trying also to restore peace in Ethiopia. And I was just inclined to wonder if we may look back and see how pivotal has the African Union been able to, try to, stimulate the situation in Ethiopia as it is right now.
Let me first start by having an input.
I should just be aware that we're capturing every movement that you're making. Yes, please.
Yes. So, let me start by putting my word or two on the AU budget, because there is a lot of bad-mouthing the African Union for ideological reasons, again. And we need to be very, very clear about this. The statistics are very clear. 38% of the AU budget is carried by member states. And that is largely operational budget. How do you run an organization? So in a sense, if the AU was just for the purpose of a functioning institution, it would be okay in terms of funding itself. And 61% of the budget, also to say, is from from donors, including African states like South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya. I know Kenya sometimes give a check to the African Union, $1 million from time to time. It has done that. So, in a sense,
so there's donation.
There is donation by the world, including Africa itself.
Including Africa itself.
And there is assessed funds,
which contributes to 38%.
That's for last year. 38% for last year. And the running budget for the African Union is 41%. That's the operational budget. 61%, 59% is the one that is supposed to be for from operations. Yeah? For operations, not from donors, from all of the issues. Remember, 54 African countries contribute money to the United Nations. And the United Nations has the responsibility, and member states have responsibility for global peace, because Africa has no mandate for peace and security matters. And therefore, there is nothing immoral or extraordinary for Africa to depend or to rely on donor or goodwill of the United Nations and so on. The mandate of the African Union to be in Somalia is not an African mandate. It's a UN mandate. It's the UN that decides when and where the Africans will be. So, in a sense, let's also be sympathetic that we don't begin to demonize and basically,
But I fail to understand, because if we have the United Nations where we never fail to remit our remittances.
Yes,
we never fail. Mm-hmm. And if we do fail, like the other day, I think it was South Sudan. Yeah, and we saw what actually was what was the punitive measures they were taking on South Sudan. Yeah, they were to be delisted, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Why can't we also do that with the African Union?
But also remember, the regional states, what we call regional powers, have gone beyond their call of duty. Mm-hmm. Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Algeria, Egypt. All these countries have always contributed more than they are due,
which is good.
The reason,
which is good, but in terms of trying to save African Union, that's my question.
No, we are not saving. We are saying
you go over and above what you're supposed to do. I mean, that is good. That is a good gesture that is coming from both countries. But we're saying, can't there be a strict measure? Because we've been talking on this platform for a while regarding these remittances, isn't it? And people are slackening off. There is no any strict sort of punishment that comes from the African Union on the countries that do not remit, which is necessary for the operations.
The countries that are in that list of unable to do are usually the ones at war. And that's where Muammar Gaddafi came in. Muammar Gaddafi understood the countries that are under stress. And what you would do is you would talk to the African Union, and because Libya under Gaddafi was wealthy, it could pay for that. So I was working for.
I tend to not understand, because these countries at war, they are paying
what
to the United Nations, the remittances.
Maybe they are, some are not able to.
Let him finish, because it's very important.
No, I just wanted to get some
the issue you're raising is important.
Yeah.
But let Kagwanja finish his point, because we all have a point.
No. Next time I'll be the host. That's okay. That's okay.
You should. Summarize.
So what one is trying to say is the following: that the birth of the African Renaissance has not benefited Africa from the perspective that we have become wealthier than we are. We are growing, but it has given hope. For centuries, we have been victims of a pessimism. No, Africa is dying. Africa should be avoided. Yes. Africa is this. There is hope in Africa. The whole mantra about Africa rising, if you analyze it from economic performance and all that, you may not get the dividend. But I am a hopeful African. I feel better today than I felt in 1990s when I was writing about the structural adjustment programs and being a slave of the IMF and the World Bank. I don't feel the same today. So thanks to the African Union and the spirit of African Renaissance. Now, that does not mean that Africa is not doing anything about itself. This particular summit has set up what we are calling the Africa Debt Observatory, in order to look at the countries that have debts and may not be able to pay or are going to be in debt distress. I think that's a positive step in terms of this collective observation by African about countries, so that in Kenya, if the country begin to borrow more like we did in the past, and we start now straining our economy, the African Union will send a red alert that we are not happy with what is happening in Kenya in terms of the debt. The same case, you look at what the African Union has done in terms of intervention. We have talked about intervention in Sudan, the hybrid force, for the first one in the world that does not include the United Nations alone. That was hybrid force. We have for the first time an Africa peacekeeping mission that is exclusively African in Somalia. And now we are talking about an exclusively African mission in Congo, in DRC. Never mind about the teething problems and what we are talking about. But the intention and the idea is that Africa will be its own Praetorian Guard. It is not going to depend on others to keep its peace. Not only that, mediation, and that's where you're talking about Ethiopia. The AU will go down in history as having resolved the Ethiopian problem. That's a huge achievement. And remember, Ethiopia is not your ordinary country on the continent. It's a major pivotal state. And that said then, being able to restore a semblance of peace and putting the country on the road to recovery and sustainable stability, then what we are talking about is that a huge achievement for the African Union. And the African Union, therefore, should not be looked at whether it is, you are looking at the balance sheet, whether it is breaking even or it's not breaking even. The responsibility for peace and security is not the African Union responsibility. And it has to be, and much of the work that is being done in Africa is a peace and security operations. And those must be paid or must be shared. It is the same thing we're talking about refugees. We'll be talking about this with the IGAD.
Yes.
Shared international responsibility. So the 61%, the 59% of the budget is not Africa's dependency on the world. It is world responsibility to share burdens.
If I just add, the great Deng Xiaoping, the great transformer of China, said he doesn't care if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches the mouse. Great wisdom, don't you think? I think that these African solutions to African problems, we as Kenya's intellectuals really want it. We think, because we want the world to see that we can solve our problems and we don't need parachutists from Europe or America to come and solve. We want them. But Debal, the irony of the people speaking in that place, they were speaking in English and in French. The irony of the African Union is that there's foreign languages. The English, Debal, nowadays has become commonplace for us to speak English. It's an international language. I don't have as much hang-ups about it. But we have to have Kiswahili from grade 1 all the way to university, so that our leaders, when they go to the African Union, can say mandugu na mabwana na madada zangu na mashemeji wenzangu. I mean, they'll be able to speak their own language. This is a cultural pacification of your own mind. And then you can speak English if you wish. Second thing is about the African Union, Debal, is the leaders of Africa can use these Africa solutions for African problems by saying, we went and bought a club and we hit those rebels in the head, and that's an African solution to our problems. Of course, that is not correct, because that's just dehumanizing it. So you're hurting other people, you're causing trouble. So we have to be careful about this term, just as much as we have to be careful about the African Renaissance. The African Renaissance produced Isaias Afwerki, probably the most terrible despot now we have. It produced Meles Zenawi, who was a great leader in Ethiopia, who brought a lot of economic development. But the failure in Ethiopia today, Debal, is his responsibility. Look at Abiy Ahmed, Debal. There was a war, the conflict has ended, and there's not been one statement about the political future of Ethiopia from the Prime Minister. A constitutional democracy, you say? Elections, you say? Constituent Assembly, you say? All these things are not there, Debal. He wants to rule in the same model as Meles Zenawi and the ones previous to him. We can't have our cake and eat it too in this continent. We have to provide a set of rights to the citizens so that our markets can work and our legal systems can work. And if we don't get that this place of power is transient, you come there, you add your block, and you leave. and another person comes and adds his block and he leaves. That way you get a civilizational discussion between citizens in the country and in the region. Well, if there's no constitutional dispensation in Ethiopia, it will fail again because the underlying issues are still there.
Thank you. Right, let's hear from Midema briefly and then we give our headline thoughts, please.
Dubal, I was interviewed on Monday by the Indian International News called WOM, which I will share with you all. And it was all about AU and AU achievement, AU failure, and what we're thinking about. And Dubal, I projected a very optimistic view of AU. I've been one of the most critical about AU because I thought it was a micro picture of AOU that is going to fall right on its tongue. In 2001, we made a very serious proposal to that body from United States. And I happened to be in Addis. They did not get back to us because the secretary didn't have ink in his typing, so he couldn't get back to us on time. The point is, Dubal, this year, 2023, AU has 8 very specific agenda, and my colleagues here have enumerated many of them and how they have gone about it. For the first time, Dubal, AU is saying, you overthrow your government, we cannot accept you as a member. This didn't happen before. Sudan, everybody overthrew government, Libya, and they were all part of AOU. You remember? I served on, for the last 2 years, on Inter-University Council of East Africa, where member states of East Africa pay dues to belong to that body. And it's one of them, the oldest coming out of East Africa community. Now, 2-3 member states did not pay their dues. But the benefit coming into the East Africa community from South Korea to US to Europe, in terms of bursary, scholarship, for everything, they want share. And they also want responsibility. We stop that. We say you are not going to get your share until you pay your dues. AU is beginning to do that. Kagwanja cited some really good examples, whether it's Ethiopia and also DRG in Congo, Somalia, and what is happening there. One of the things that AU is doing is bolstering institutional capacity. You know, we can't expect Sudan, they've been fighting from the beginning, that they have the ability to conduct a normal meeting, so that they can come up with a rational idea without institutional capacity. And AU is involved in doing that.
Right, thank you.
So we're merging, we're closing. Let me finish my last point.
Yeah.
My last point is Africa must move from father-child relationship, because the parents are going to take care of me, whether misbehave or not, to now begin taking care of Africa.
Indeed. Right, thank you. Professor Naomi Damba, let me just give you 20 seconds. Dr. Kanenje, to just give your closing remarks, 20 seconds.
20 seconds, everybody.
Yeah, the wars that Africa faces, from economics to disease to conflict, are enormous. And Dibal, we cannot go to war with mercenaries. For us to control our agenda, we're going to need to control our money.
Thank you. All right, Professor Kagwanja, 30 seconds.
We want to notice the launch of the paper on the global security initiative by China, because it is a counter to, not a counter, but a different vision from the American, national security strategy that was issued in October. And I think this is something we will be reading to see what vision China has for, for the world. But also we have to look at the peaceful development initiative on the Horn of Africa, which China unveiled here And again, that's going to play within the larger section of the AU peace and security.
Right. Ahmed Hashi.
Dr. I think that we should be very careful about what's going to happen in Mogadishu from the next 30 to 60 days. Kenyan security forces have to be on alert. I think the Shabab are going to mount a massive attack on Hassan Sheikh's government. I hope I'm proved wrong, but that's my view. It will happen in the next 60 days.
All right, and of course also a big day today where we will see the First Lady of the US who will be in the country. And just to show you as well what is on the front page of the week as we're winding up. This is Biden. They're saying 2024 handoff. And they're asking a very poignant question there. Will an aging Biden be the Democrats' best and only option? Right? That is the latest that we have from the week as well. And also questions about the Brexit. 3 years on, was it worth it? 3 years on, was it worth it? Brexit now with his challenges, especially accessing the market as well. So we'll be following up on this next week and looking forward to the visiting of the First Lady Jill Biden, who will be set to be in the country today until the 26th. And we see what she brings to bear also to this country and on tying our relations with the US. Thank you very much.